The summer sun bore down relentlessly on the crowded streets of New York City one busy afternoon in 2015. The concrete seemed to shimmer under the heat, while the city pulsed with its usual chaos, horns blaring, sirens wailing in the distance, and the steady hum of conversations blending into a constant murmur. Amid the bustle, a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled steadily down Fifth Avenue, its glossy exteriors reflecting the glaring sunlight. At the helm of the motorcade was the iconic Cadillac 1, carrying none other than Donald Trump. Inside the air-conditioned cabin, Trump, then a high-profile businessman and newly declared presidential candidate, was engrossed in a report being presented by one of his advisors. His expression was focused, brows furrowed slightly as he skimmed through the pages in front of him. "Sir," the advisor began, "if we focus on these regions for your next campaign stops—" But Trump wasn't listening anymore. His attention had shifted, his sharp eyes catching something unusual on the bustling sidewalk. He leaned closer to the window, his gaze narrowing. Amid the sea of moving people, a young boy stood out like a solitary island. He was small and frail, no older than 10, with unkempt hair and a face that looked like it hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. The boy's clothes were threadbare, an old faded t-shirt and jeans that were too short for his growing frame. His shoes were barely intact, the soles worn down to almost nothing. But it wasn't just his appearance that held Trump's attention. It was the cardboard sign he held tightly in his hands. The sign was simple, its message scrawled in large, uneven letters. "Please help my family. We need a miracle." Trump's eyes lingered on the boy for a moment longer. There was something in the child's posture, something both desperate and hopeful. Unlike the rushed pedestrians who pushed past him, the boy stood still, his wide, bright eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for someone, anyone, who might stop. Trump set the report aside, his expression changing. "Stop the car," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the cabin. The motorcade came to a halt, its sudden stop causing murmurs of confusion among nearby drivers and pedestrians. The lead bodyguard turned around, his expression one of concern. "Sir, this area isn't secure," the guard cautioned. "We should keep moving." Trump waved off the warning, his tone unyielding. "I said stop the car," he repeated, his gaze never wavering from the boy. "I need to talk to him." As the car door opened, the commotion outside grew. Passers-by paused in their tracks, some recognizing Trump and quickly pulling out their phones to record. His sudden appearance on the busy street was nothing short of a spectacle. Unbothered by the attention, Trump stepped out onto the sidewalk, his polished shoes crunching against the gritty pavement. His imposing figure, dressed in a tailored suit, contrasted starkly with the boy's small, vulnerable frame. But he approached with a surprising gentleness, his movements deliberate, almost cautious, as he knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" Trump asked, his deep voice steady but softer than usual. The boy looked up, startled at first by the sudden attention. His small hands gripped the cardboard sign tightly, as though it were a lifeline. After a moment he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Matthew." "Well, Matthew," Trump said, his expression softening, "why are you standing out here with this sign?" Matthew hesitated. His eyes darted nervously to the crowd gathering around them before returning to Trump. There was a fleeting moment of silence as the boy seemed to gather his courage, and then he spoke. "My mom's really sick," Matthew said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I don't know what else to do. I've been praying to God every day. I think maybe he'll send someone to help us." Trump paused, visibly moved by the boy's words. He studied Matthew's face, the dirt smudges on his cheeks, the tired look in his eyes, and the faint glimmer of hope that hadn't yet faded. This wasn't a boy asking for sympathy. This was a child holding on to something greater, faith. "How long have you been praying?" Trump asked after a moment, his tone quieter now. "Every day," Matthew replied firmly. His small hands tightened around the edges of the sign as though it grounded him. "My dad always told me that God never leaves us. I believe he heard my prayers." For a brief moment, the bustling world around them seemed to fade. Trump felt a strange sense of clarity as he looked at Matthew. Here was a child who had been through more hardship than most adults could imagine, yet he stood unwavering in his belief that something or someone would come through for him. A faint smile crossed Trump's face. "Maybe he did hear you," he said. "Maybe that's why I'm here." Trump straightened up, gesturing to his bodyguards. "Matthew, take me to your home. I want to meet your mom." Matthew's face lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He nodded quickly, leading Trump toward a narrow side street. The motorcade followed, its sleek vehicles looking out of place as they navigated the deteriorating neighborhood. Towering skyscrapers and luxury storefronts faded into the background, replaced by cracked sidewalks, graffiti-stained walls, and abandoned lots overrun with weeds. Inside the car, Trump sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. The shift in the environment was stark, almost jarring. He glanced at Matthew, who now sat beside him, his small frame perched on the edge of the leather seat. "Weren't you scared standing out there all alone?" Trump asked. Matthew shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No, sir. My dad used to say that if you believe in God, you don't have to be afraid. I just had to do my part." Trump nodded slowly, his respect for the boy growing. "You've got a lot of courage, Matthew. That's something not everyone has, even adults." Matthew glanced up at Trump, a shy smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, sir." After several turns, the car slowed to a stop. Matthew pointed to a makeshift shelter at the end of the block. "That's where we live," he said softly. Trump stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching against the gravel-strewn road. The shelter in front of him was pieced together from scraps of wood and tarps. Its roof sagged slightly, and the walls bore the unmistakable marks of weathering and neglect. Trump's expression hardened, not in anger, but in determination. Matthew led him inside. The interior was dim, the faint light from a small window casting long shadows across the cramped space. A frail woman lay on a worn-out mattress in the corner, her face pale and her breathing labored. She stirred weakly as Matthew entered, her tired eyes widening when she saw the figure following her son. "Mom, this is Mr. Trump," Matthew said, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and hope. "He's here to help us." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she tried to sit up, her movements slow and unsteady. "Mr. Trump," she whispered, her voice rasping. Is it really you?" Trump moved closer, kneeling beside her. He gently took her hand, his large frame somehow seeming smaller in the intimacy of the moment. "Yes, it's me," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And I believe God sent me here today." The boy, Matthew, began to lead the way. The motorcade moved at a crawl, navigating the narrowing streets that bore the scars of neglect. Towering skyscrapers and shimmering luxury storefronts soon gave way to a very different New York, a world of rusted tin roofs, crumbling facades, and trash-strewn alleyways. Children with dirt-smeared faces played on the sidewalks, while weary adults sat on stoops, their eyes dull with resignation. The contrast between the two worlds was stark, almost jarring. Inside the Cadillac one, Donald Trump watched the changing scenery with a furrowed brow. The images outside the tinted window stirred something deep within him, an awareness of lives lived in quiet desperation, hidden in the shadows of a thriving metropolis. He broke the silence, turning to the boy seated next to him. "Matthew," Trump began, his voice even but tinged with curiosity, "weren't you scared standing out there all alone? Anything could have happened." Matthew shook his head firmly, his small hands clasped tightly on his lap. "No, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite his young age. "My dad used to say that if you believe in God, you don't have to be afraid. I wasn't alone. I know he was watching over me." Trump regarded the boy with a mixture of admiration and respect. It wasn't just the words Matthew spoke, but the conviction with which he said them. Here was a child whose faith seemed unshakable, even in the face of hardship most adults would crumble under. "You have a strong faith, Matthew," Trump said after a moment. "And you're right. You weren't alone. I promise you, I won't let you down." Matthew looked up at him, his wide eyes reflecting both gratitude and hope. He didn't say anything, but the slight smile on his face spoke volumes. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things might actually change. The motorcade slowed further, finally pulling up in front of what could barely be described as a home. The structure was pieced together from scraps of wood and tarps, its roof sagging under the weight of time and weather. "This is where we live," Matthew said softly, motioning toward the shelter. Trump stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. His security detail flanked him immediately, their wary eyes scanning the surroundings. But Trump's attention was fixed on the shelter before him. It was a testament to resilience, fragile and imperfect, yet standing strong against all odds. Matthew led Trump inside. The air in the small shelter was thick, damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. Dim light filtered in through cracks in the walls, casting long shadows that danced across the room. There was no furniture to speak of, only a few battered boxes stacked in the corner and a thin mattress on the floor. On that mattress lay a frail woman, her breaths shallow and labored. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, and her hands trembled slightly as she turned her head toward the doorway. At first, her gaze fell on Matthew, and her lips curved into a weak smile. But when her eyes shifted to the tall, imposing figure following her son, her expression changed. Recognition flickered across her face, and she struggled to sit up. "Mum," Matthew said, his voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and hope. "This is Mr. Trump. God sent him to help us." Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she looked up at Trump. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, she whispered, "Mr. Trump, did God really send you?" Trump knelt beside her, his large hand gently taking hers. It felt small and cold in his grasp. He looked her in the eye, his expression one of both compassion and resolve. "Maybe he did," he said softly. "I can't say for certain, but I believe God wanted me here today." Her tears began to fall freely, streaking down her sunken cheeks. "I've prayed every day," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I've prayed that someone would see us, that someone would help. Maybe he finally heard me." Trump gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "He heard you," he said firmly, "and now it's my turn to make sure your prayers are answered." Rising to his full height, Trump turned toward his entourage, his commanding presence filling the small space. His voice was steady, but carried an edge of urgency. "I want a doctor here tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She needs a full medical evaluation, and I want a complete report on this family's situation. Living conditions, needs, everything." One of his advisors hesitated, stepping forward cautiously. "Sir, we could coordinate with local charities." Trump cut him off, his voice sharp. "No, Matthew's faith brought me here. This boy believes in God, and I refuse to let him down. We start helping them now, not later." The advisor nodded, stepping back without another word. The air in the room was charged with the weight of Trump's resolve. Turning back to Matthew's mother, Trump's expression softened. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to bear. But from this moment on, you're not alone. We're going to get you the help you need." She looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, her lips trembling as though searching for the right words. But no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, her tears continuing to fall. Matthew stood silently beside his mother, his small hand resting on hers. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something in her eyes that had been missing for so long: hope. As Trump stepped out of the shelter, he was met with a growing crowd. The sight of the sleek motorcade parked in such a humble neighborhood had drawn curious onlookers, their expressions ranging from skepticism to intrigue. Many held up their phones, capturing the moment. Trump turned to address them, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Today, I came here because of a boy named Matthew," he began. He stood on a street corner with nothing but faith in his heart and a belief that someone would hear him. His faith led me here, and now it's our responsibility, mine and yours, to make sure that faith is never in vain. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Slowly, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. The sound echoed through the narrow streets, a ripple of hope spreading through the community. Trump glanced back at the shelter, where Matthew stood in the doorway, watching with wide eyes. Their gazes met, and Trump gave him a small, reassuring nod. "Let's get to work," Trump said to his team as he turned back toward the motorcade. "This is just the beginning." When Donald Trump stepped out of the makeshift shelter, he was greeted by a swelling crowd of curious onlookers. Word had traveled quickly in the tight-knit neighborhood. Families had emerged from their homes. Children peeked out from behind their parents, and teenagers stood off to the side, holding their phones up to record the unexpected scene. The once quiet and desolate alley was now alive with murmurs and whispers. Trump, towering above the crowd, raised a hand to signal for silence. The noise subsided as all eyes turned to him. The towering figure of the businessman, standing amid crumbling walls and rusted roofs, seemed almost surreal to those watching. He began to speak, his voice steady and commanding, yet carrying a warmth that resonated with those listening. "I didn't come here today just for Matthew and his mother," he said, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "I came here because Matthew reminded me of something important, something we should all remember. God never abandons anyone, and when we have the ability to help, we must become His instruments." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight sinking into the hearts of those gathered. There was a brief silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city in the distance. Then, a few tentative claps arose from the back of the crowd. Slowly, others joined in, the applause growing louder and stronger until it echoed off the narrow alley walls. In that moment, something shifted. Faces that had once seemed worn and defeated now held glimmers of hope. Children's eyes lit up with curiosity and excitement, while adults exchanged nods and murmurs of agreement. The crowd wasn't just applauding Trump's words, they were embracing the idea that change was possible, even in their forgotten corner of the city. The scene in the alley was only the beginning. Within hours, videos of Trump's visit and his interaction with Matthew began circulating online. Clips of his speech spread like wildfire, shared across social media platforms with captions like "a miracle in the making" and "faith in action." One video in particular, showing Trump kneeling to speak with Matthew and later holding the boy's hand as they entered the shelter, struck a chord with viewers nationwide. The raw emotion in the footage, the mix of Matthew's innocent hope and Trump's genuine compassion, was impossible to ignore. Churches across the country began organizing special prayer services, inspired by Matthew's faith and the idea that prayer could lead to action. Communities rallied together to collect donations for struggling families, especially those of veterans. A movement began to take shape, one that would come to be known as Miracles Through Faith. The movement wasn't confined to church walls. Businesses, schools, and local organizations joined in, each contributing in their own way. Some hosted food and clothing drives, while others pledged to offer job training or financial assistance to those in need. Celebrities used their platforms to amplify Matthew's story, urging their followers to take part in the growing wave of compassion. As the movement gained momentum, stories began to pour in from all corners of the country. In Texas, a small church organized a fundraiser to cover medical bills for a local family whose father, a veteran, was battling cancer. In Ohio, a group of volunteers renovated a home for a single mother and her children, inspired by Matthew's belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could make a difference. One particularly moving story came from a high school in California. where students decided to dedicate their annual charity drive to veterans' families. The students worked tirelessly, collecting school supplies, groceries, and even Christmas gifts for children in need. Matthew reminded us that faith isn't just about believing, it's about doing, one student said in an interview. Even those who had been skeptical at first found themselves drawn to the movement. It wasn't just about religion or charity, it was about humanity. The message was simple but profound. Everyone had the power to be a part of someone else's miracle. For Matthew and his mother, life changed almost overnight. Donations poured in, and volunteers arrived at their shelter, bringing food, clothing, and supplies. Doctors examined Matthew's mother and began providing the care she so desperately needed. The dilapidated shelter that had once been their home was replaced with a modest but comfortable apartment, funded by the growing support from the Miracles Through Faith movement. But Matthew's story didn't just change his family's life, it inspired countless others to step forward and make a difference in their own communities. Churches began preaching sermons about turning faith into action, drawing on Matthew's unwavering belief as an example. Faith is the seed, one pastor said, but love and action are the water and sunlight that make it grow. Weeks later, Matthew and his mother were invited to attend a special event at the White House. The event, organized to honor families of veterans and celebrate the success of the Miracles Through Faith movement, was attended by thousands. The grand hall buzzed with anticipation as people gathered to hear stories of hope and transformation. When it was Trump's turn to speak, he stepped to the podium, his presence commanding but approachable. The room fell silent as he began. "Matthew taught me something powerful," Trump said, his voice carrying across the hall. "He reminded me that faith isn't just about waiting for miracles, it's about believing in them so strongly that you're willing to act. We don't need miracles from the sky because God has already given us the tools we need, our hands, our hearts. These are what create the miracles that change lives." The crowd erupted into applause, but Trump raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't about me," he continued. "This is about Matthew and every child like him who believes in something greater. It's about all of us stepping up to make sure that no one is forgotten." Then, with a gesture, he called Matthew to the stage. The boy, dressed in a simple suit, walked up hesitantly, his wide eyes scanning the room. Trump knelt slightly, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Matthew," he said, "would you like to say something?" Matthew nodded, taking a small step forward to the microphone. His voice was soft but steady, carrying the quiet strength of someone wise beyond his years. "I prayed to God for help," he began, "and I believe He heard me. But I also learned something else. The greatest miracles don't just come from God, they come from people helping each other. That's how He works. When we love each other, that's when miracles happen." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Many wiped away tears as they clapped, moved by the simplicity and sincerity of Matthew's words. The event marked a turning point, not just for Matthew's family, but for the entire nation. The Miracles Through Faith movement continued to grow, its impact spreading far beyond its original intent. It became a symbol of what could happen when people chose to let their faith guide their actions. Matthew's story served as a reminder that miracles aren't just divine interventions. They're the everyday acts of kindness that bring light to the darkest corners of the world. His unwavering belief and Trump's willingness to act showed a nation what was possible when compassion and faith joined forces. As one pastor put it during a sermon, Matthew 5:16 says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Today we've seen that light shine, and it's brighter than ever. As we come to the end of this extraordinary story, let us pause and reflect on what it has taught us, not just about Matthew and his family, but about ourselves and the world we live in. This story isn't just a tale of one boy's faith or one man's decision to help. It's a reminder of something deeper, something universal, the undeniable power of compassion, faith, and community to transform lives. Matthew's unwavering belief that God would send help was the spark that ignited a movement. It wasn't grand gestures or boundless resources that created the change. It was the act of listening, of stopping to see someone in need and acting with love and purpose. Each of us has the capacity to be that spark for someone else. The question is, will we choose to let our light shine? In a world where the noise of everyday life can often drown out the cries of those who need help the most, Matthew's story reminds us to slow down and listen, to pay attention to the small signs of faith and hope that are all around us. Sometimes it's a boy with a cardboard sign. Sometimes it's a quiet prayer whispered in the dark. And sometimes it's an opportunity right in front of us, a chance to be the answer to someone's prayer. But this isn't just about faith in the divine. It's about faith in each other. It's about believing that we, as individuals and as a collective, can create miracles through small, intentional acts of kindness. Each smile we give, each helping hand we extend, and each moment we take to care for another person is a reflection of something greater, a reflection of God's love working through us. As you go forward from this story, I want to leave you with a challenge. Find your Matthew. Look for the people in your life or in your community who might need a little hope, a little kindness, or simply someone to listen. You don't have to do something grand or heroic. Sometimes the simplest acts carry the greatest meaning. Hold the door open for a stranger. Call someone who might be feeling lonely. Offer a word of encouragement to someone who's struggling. Donate to a cause you care about, or volunteer your time to help those in need. These small actions, when multiplied by millions of people, become a force of change more powerful than any single person could imagine. Let us also remember the power of faith, not just faith in God, but faith in humanity. It's easy to become cynical in a world that often feels divided and harsh, but Matthew's story reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is always light, and that light often comes from unexpected places. A child's unwavering belief, a stranger's compassion, a community coming together to make a difference. For those of you who believe in prayer, continue to pray, not just for yourself or your loved ones, but for those who might not have anyone praying for them. Pray for the families like Matthew's who are still waiting for their miracle. Pray for the strength to act when the opportunity arises. And pray for the courage to be the miracle someone else needs. For those of you who may not pray but still believe in the power of kindness, let this story inspire you to keep doing good. Your actions matter more than you know. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways you may never see but are no less real. To all of you reading this, remember, we are all connected. When one of us suffers, we all suffer. But when one of us chooses to help, that act of love lifts us all. The world is full of Matthews, people quietly hoping and praying for someone to notice, someone to care. Let us all strive to be the person who notices. Let us all strive to be the person who cares. As we close this chapter, I leave you with this blessing. May your heart always be open to the needs of others, and may your hands always be willing to help. May your faith, whatever form it takes, guide you toward acts of kindness and love. May you be the light in someone's darkness, the hope in someone's despair, and the miracle someone has been waiting for. May you find joy in giving, peace in serving, and fulfillment in knowing you have made a difference. And may the words of Matthew 5:16 stay with you always. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. Thank you for being a part of this journey. And thank you in advance for the good you will do in the world. Go forth and let your light shine. With love, faith, and hope, blessings to you all.